I didn't plan to stop at Beer Lake. It was supposed to be just another stretch of road, another empty horizon cutting through the kind of land that doesn't ask questions and doesn't offer answers. The sky was too wide out there, the air too still. Even the wind felt like it had somewhere else to be. But then the road curved, just slightly, and the lake appeared. At first, it didn't look real. The water was too blue, not the kind of blue you expect from something natural, something alive. It looked painted, still, flat, in a way that made depth feel like a lie. I remember slowing the car without thinking. There's a certain kind of silence you get in places like this, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that lets your mind rest. This was something else, a silence that felt like it was waiting, like it had been there long before you arrived and would remain long after you left. I pulled over. Gravel crunched under the tires, loud enough to feel wrong against everything else. When I stepped out, the sound echoed farther than it should have, as if the space around me was hollow, stretched thin. The lake didn't move, no ripples, no wind touching the surface, nothing. Just a sheet of perfect, unmoving blue. I walked closer to the edge, each step slower than the last, like something in me was trying to measure the distance, not in feet, but in consequences. You'd expect water to feel alive, even when it's calm. There's always something beneath it, motion, energy, a sense that it's doing something you just can't see yet. But this felt different. It felt like the surface wasn't hiding movement, it felt like it was hiding absence. I crouched down near the shoreline, watching the way the light sat on the top of the water instead of sinking into it. My reflection stared back at me, but it looked delayed, not distorted, just slightly behind, like the lake was taking an extra second to decide whether or not to show me to myself. That's when I noticed something else. There were no birds, not a single one. No sound overhead, no distant calls, nothing circling the water. Even the insects seemed to keep their distance. The entire place felt avoided, and I didn't know why, not yet. I remembered thinking it was strange, but not enough to leave, not enough to turn around and get back in the car, because places like this, places that feel wrong without explaining themselves, they pull at something deeper than logic. Curiosity, maybe, or something older than that. I stood there longer than I should have, staring into water that refused to give anything back, waiting for a ripple, a shift, a sign that what I was feeling was just in my head. But the lake stayed still, perfectly still, and then, for just a moment, I thought I saw something. Not a shape, not a body, nothing I could point to and say, there. It was more like a disturbance, a suggestion of movement just beneath the surface, the kind of thing your eyes catch before your brain has time to understand it. I blinked, and it was gone. The water returned to that same impossible calm, like nothing had ever been there in the first place. But something had changed, not in the lake, in me, because now I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been looking into the water. I had been looking at something that was looking back. I stepped away from the edge, slow, careful, like turning your back on something you don't fully understand but know better than to challenge. The silence followed me, even as I reached the car, even as I closed the door, even as the engine turned over. It stayed there, pressing in, unbroken. And as I pulled back onto the road, I checked the mirror, just once. The lake was still there, calm, empty, harmless, exactly the way it had looked when I first saw it. But now I knew something I hadn't known before. People don't come out here because it's beautiful. They come because of the stories, because something in that water had already been seen. The first time anyone said they saw it, there were no stories yet, no legends, no warnings, nothing to shape what they were looking at or what they thought they understood. Just a man, a horse, and the edge of a beer lake. It was early, before the sun had fully settled into the sky, the kind of morning where everything feels unfinished, like the world is still deciding what it wants to be that day. The air was cold, thin enough to carry sound farther than it should. He rode along the shoreline without thinking much of it. Back then, the lake wasn't a place people avoided. It was just water, just another part of the land, until the horse stopped. Not slowed, stopped, mid-step. The man pulled the reins, confused at first, then irritated. Horses spoke sometimes, a shadow, a scent, something unseen in the brush, but this was different. The animal didn't rear, didn't panic, it just refused. Its ears were forward, locked toward the water, its body stiff in a way that wasn't fear, not the kind you run from. Something more focused than that, something that holds you still instead of driving you away. That's when he heard it, a sound from the lake, soft, low, not a splash, not the movement of waves or wind. It was heavier than that, slower, like something large shifting its weight beneath the surface. He turned his head toward the water, and at first there was nothing, just that same stillness, the same flat, endless blue, and then the surface broke, not violently, not like something bursting upward. It parted, like the water itself was making room. A shape rose, slow enough that it didn't feel real at first, long, dark, wrong in a way that didn't fit into anything familiar. It didn't come all the way out, not enough to understand it, just enough to know it didn't belong there. The man didn't move, couldn't. His hands stayed on the reins, but he wasn't holding them anymore. His body had gone quiet, like it was trying not to be noticed. The horse made a sound then, low, strained, almost like a warning it couldn't finish. The shape shifted, not toward him, just in the water. A subtle turn, a change in angle, as if whatever it was had become aware of the shoreline, of the man, of the animal standing frozen beside him. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like distance didn't matter, like the space between them wasn't measured in yards, but in attention. The head, if that's what it was, lifted slightly higher. No clear features, no eyes he could point to, but he knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from seeing, but from being seen, that it was looking directly at him. The surface trembled around it, just enough to break the perfect calm. Rings spread outward, slow and deliberate, distorting the reflection of the sky, and then it sank. No splash, no struggle, just a quiet, unnatural descent, like it had never broken the surface at all. The water sealed itself behind it, perfect again. Still, the man stayed there longer than he should have, waiting, watching, trying to force his mind to make sense of something that didn't fit into anything he'd ever known. But there was nothing left to see, only the lake and the silence. When he finally turned the horse, it moved without resistance this time, too easily, like whatever had held it there had already passed. He didn't tell the story right away, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. There are things you can describe, shapes, sizes, movements, and there are things that leave something behind in you, something that doesn't translate into words. By the time he did speak of it, the details had already begun to shift, not intentionally, just naturally, the way memory protects itself from what it can't fully hold. Some said he described a serpent, others heard something closer to a creature with a head too large for its body. A few claimed it had limbs, but none of them had been there. None of them had felt that moment when the lake stopped being just water and became something that could look back. Stories don't spread on their own, not like that, not across towns, across miles, across people who weren't there but start to feel like they were. Stories need a voice, and in the case of Bear Lake Monster, that voice belonged to a man named Joseph C. Rich. By the time his words reached the public, the lake had already been seen differently by a few scattered witnesses. Quiet accounts passed from one person to another, soft enough to be doubted, fragile enough to disappear, but Rich didn't whisper. He printed column after column, detail after detail, descriptions that felt too complete for something so uncertain. He didn't just report what had been seen, he expanded it. The creature became longer, stronger, more defined, a serpent stretching across the water, a head rising higher than it should, movements that suggested intelligence, awareness, intention, and people read it. Of course they did. In a place where the land felt endless and the known wasn't just possible but expected. A story like that didn't sound impossible. It sounded familiar, not with proof, not with evidence, with certainty. The kind that comes from ink on paper, the kind that doesn't ask if something is real, only how real it might be. Soon the accounts began to multiply. People who had never spoken before started remembering things, a ripple they couldn't explain, a shadow that moved against the current, a shape glimpsed just once, long ago, that suddenly made sense now, and each time a new sighting surfaced, it found its way back into print, back into Rich's hands, back into the story. But there was something strange about the way he wrote it. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't leave room for doubt the way most people would when describing something unseen, something uncertain. He wrote like a man who already knew, like someone describing a place he'd visited, not just heard about. And the details? They didn't stay the same. In one account, the creature moved like a serpent, smooth, continuous. In another, it had structure, form, something closer to limbs, or at least the suggestion of them. Sometimes its head was narrow, sometimes it wasn't. The body stretched longer in one telling, shorter in the next. Not wildly different, just enough. Just enough to make you wonder whether the creature was changing or the story was. But no one questioned it, not openly, because the more it was printed, the more it felt real. And the more it felt real, the less people wanted to challenge it. That's the thing about fear when it's shared. It doesn't weaken, it sharpens. By the time the story reached its peak, Bear Lake wasn't just a lake anymore. It was a place with something in it, something known, something named. And once something is named, it stops being a possibility. It becomes something you expect to find, even if you never see it, even if you're standing at the edge of the water, staring into the same impossible stillness, telling yourself there's nothing there. Part of you is already waiting for it to rise because someone put it there, line by line, detail by detail, until the lake didn't feel empty anymore, until the silence didn't feel natural, until every ripple, real or imagined, carried the same question beneath it. Was it always there, or did someone teach people how to see it? Once the story had a name, it stopped belonging to one man. It spread from print to voice, from voice to memory, from memory to something far less stable. At Bear Lake, people didn't just repeat what they had read, they added to it. Quietly at first, a fisherman who claimed the body wasn't smooth like a serpent, but broken, uneven, like something built in sections. A woman who swore the head rose too high from the water, too heavy to belong to anything that moved the way it did. A traveler who described a motion that wasn't gliding but pulling, as if something beneath the surface was dragging the rest of it forward. Individually, the accounts didn't match, but together, they didn't cancel each other out. They made something worse, because now the creature didn't have a single form, it had possibilities. Some said it had no legs at all, just a long, continuous body that slipped through the water without resistance. Others instead insisted they had seen something different, something that broke the surface in pieces, short protrusions, movements that didn't belong to a serpent, limbs not clear, not fully visible, but there. And then there were the descriptions that didn't fit anywhere. A head shaped wrong, too wide at the top, narrowing too sharply, a mouth that opened in a way no one could quite explain later, a motion that didn't follow the rules of anything known, too smooth in one moment, too rigid in the next. It should have fallen apart. That's what happens when stories change too much. They lose their shape, their credibility, their hold, but this one didn't, because no matter how different the details became, one thing stayed the same: the feeling. Every person who claimed to see it described that same moment when the lake stopped being water and became something aware. They didn't agree on what it looked like, but they agreed on what it did to them. It held them, not physically, something deeper than that. Like the world had paused, not around them, but because of them, as if the act of being seen had changed something fundamental, something they couldn't undo. That's what made the differences matter less, because the mind can misinterpret shapes, distance, light, movement, but that kind of feeling, that doesn't come from guessing. That comes from something real enough to reach into you and leave something behind. And the more accounts spread, the less people focused on the details. And the more they focused on that shared certainty that they hadn't imagined it, that something had been there, even if it didn't look the same twice, which led to a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Not then, not yet, because all of them were telling the truth. Then whatever lived in Bear Lake wasn't just one thing, or worse, it didn't need to stay the same to be real. By the time the story settled into something people no longer laughed at it, it stopped being curiosity. It became a challenge. If something was in Bear Lake, then it could be found. There was the thinking, simple, direct, the kind of logic that works everywhere else and on land, in daylight, against things that follow rules. Groups began to form, not large at first, just a few men at a time. Fishermen, locals, travelers who had heard enough to feel that quiet pull toward the water. Boats were pulled out, ropes gathered, tools carried, not because anyone knew what they were dealing with, but because doing nothing felt worse. They went out early, before the wind, before the surface had a chance to move on its own. The lake stretched around them, wide and silent, the shoreline fading just enough to remind them how much space there really was. Out there, the water didn't look blue anymore. It looked deep, the kind of deep that doesn't reflect the light the same way. They spread out, eyes fixed on the surface, watching for anything, a break, a ripple, a shift that didn't belong. At first, nothing happened. Minutes passed, then hours. The lake remained exactly what it had always appeared to be. Calm, empty, undisturbed. But the longer they stayed, the more that calm began to feel deliberate, like it was holding itself in place. One of the men claimed he saw movement not far, just beneath the surface, a line that didn't match the way water usually behaves. It was enough to bring the others closer, their boats cutting slowly through the silence, oars dipping in and out with careful precision. They circled the area, waited, watched, and for a moment, Something changed, not visibly, not in a way they could point to, but the air shifted. That same stillness from the shoreline, the same unnatural quiet, it settled around them again, heavier this time, harder to ignore when there was nothing else to focus on. Another man tightened his grip on the side of the boat. He wouldn't say it then, but later he described the feeling the same way the others had, like being noticed, not from a distance, from below. They tried to provoke it, dropped lines deeper than necessary, dragged hooks through the water, made noise loud enough to disturb anything that might be hiding. But the lake didn't respond, not with movement, not with resistance. Nothing rose to meet them, nothing broke the surface, and yet no one felt alone out there. Hours turned into something harder to measure. The sun climbed higher, light pressing down onto the water, flattening everything into a single, blinding plane. Still nothing. Eventually, one by one, they stopped trying, not because they were convinced nothing was there, but because something in them had begun to resist the idea of finding it. They turned back, boats drifting toward the shore, slower than before, quieter. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound uncertain, or worse, foolish. But when they reached land, when their feet touched something solid again, the relief came too quickly, too naturally, like they had been somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And even then, no one could agree on what happened. Some insisted the lake was empty, others claimed they had felt something just beneath them, moving without sound. A few said nothing at all. They just didn't go back, because the truth was harder to explain than any story printed in a newspaper. They hadn't found anything, not a body, not a shape, not proof, but they had come back with something else, something quieter, something that didn't need to be seen to exist. The understanding that whatever lived in Bear Lake didn't have to surface to be there. He didn't go looking for it. That's the part people always get wrong. The ones who went out in groups with boats and ropes and noise, they expected something to happen. They were prepared for it, in the way people think preparation can protect them from what they don't understand. But he wasn't. He was just a fisherman, alone, the kind of man who trusted routine more than stories, who had been to Bear Lake enough times to believe he knew it, or at least he knew enough to ignore what others said about it. It was late when he went out, not night, not yet. That quiet space between day and dark where the light doesn't disappear, it just fades into something softer. The shoreline behind him had already begun to lose its shape, blending into shadow, while the water ahead held on to the last of the sky. He rowed further than usual, not because he meant to, because the lake didn't give him a reason to stop. Out there, the distance becomes harder to judge. The surface stretches in every direction, smooth and uninterrupted, and before you realize it, the land feels farther away than it should. He dropped his line, waited. The boat rocked gently beneath him, the only movement in a place that seemed otherwise frozen in time. The sound of the water against the wood was soft, steady, almost enough to let the mind drift, and for a while, nothing happened. No bites, no wind, no shift in the water, just that familiar stillness until the line moved. And not a tug, not the sharp pull of a fish, something slower. He looked down at it, expecting to see the line tighten, dip, react the way it should, but it didn't. It stayed almost slack, drifting slightly to one side as if something below had brushed against it rather than taken it. He frowned, leaning forward, eyes fixed on the point where the line disappeared into the water. That's when the lake changed, not all at once, subtly. The surface around the boat began to move, not in waves, not in ripples, that spread outward. It shifted in place, a slow, controlled disturbance that didn't travel far, like something beneath was displacing the water without breaking through it. He froze, not out of fear, not yet, out of recognition. This wasn't normal. The movement grew, wider now, closer to the boat. The line drifted again, this time pulling slightly downward, not with force but with intention, like something had found it and was following it back. He reached for it, then stopped, because the water beside the boat rose, not enough to splash, not enough to spill over, just enough to lift. A long, smooth shape pressed upward from below, distorting the surface in a way that revealed nothing clearly, but suggested everything: length, mass, presence. It moved alongside him, keeping pace with the boat, though the boat wasn't moving. The fisherman didn't breathe, didn't reach for the oars, didn't move at all, because something in him understood this wasn't an attack. It wasn't hurting him. It was there, and it knew he was there too. The shape shifted slightly, angling closer. The water thinned over it just for a moment, just enough for something to almost break through. A suggestion of a head, maybe, or something that could become one if it rose another inch. But it didn't. It stayed just beneath the surface, close enough that he could feel it, not physically, not through touch, but through something deeper, something that made his chest tighten and his thoughts slow to a crawl. Then, without warning, it moved ahead of him, the disturbance sliding forward, circling the front of the boat in a wide, controlled arc. The water followed it, bending around something unseen, revealing its path without ever exposing its form. And for a moment, it stopped, right in front of him. The surface stilled again, but not completely. There was a slight rise, a subtle tension in the water, like something was holding itself just beneath it, waiting, watching. He couldn't see eyes, couldn't see a face, but the feeling was unmistakable. It was looking at him, not passing by, not ignoring him, acknowledging him. The fisherman's hand tightened around the edge of the boat. Every instinct told him to move, to row, to turn, to get away from whatever this was, but something stronger held him there. The same stillness, the same unnatural pause that others had described but never fully explained. Time stretched, or maybe it stopped, and then, just as quietly as it had come, it sank. The shape dissolved into the depth beneath him, the water folding back into itself, erasing every trace of what had been there. The line drifted again, loose, empty. The lake returned to its perfect calm, like nothing had ever disturbed it. He didn't wait, didn't check the line again, didn't look back. He grabbed the oars and pulled harder than he ever had before, the boat cutting through the water with a force that finally broke the silence around him. But even as he moved, even as the distance between him and the spot grew, he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't left, that it was still there, not following him, not chasing, just existing beneath the surface of Bear Lake. And now it knew what he looked like.